So I'd like to kick us off. Thanks for joining us today, the Glenn College Colloquium series. We're excited to have Dr. Pasque with us today. Before we get started, though, I want to remind the audience that our culture is to allow the speaker to present for her first 30 minutes, with only clarifying questions from the audience during those first 30 minutes. Of course, the speaker may pause, ask for feedback during the talk, but we otherwise ask that you hold your more substantive questions until the end of the presentation. We truly value audience engagement and hope to have a dynamic and constructive discussion at the conclusion of the presentation. I'll turn it over to Nicole to introduce our awesome speaker.
Thank you, Alan. Hi, everyone. I have the honor of offering a very brief introduction of Dr. Penny Pasque, our colloquium speaker this morning, and certainly save the far majority of the time to hear from her. So Dr. Pasque is, one of OSU's own. She's a professor in educational studies, the director of the qualitative lab, and the director of the qualitative methods in the Office of Research, Innovation, and Collaboration. I'm making sure I'm getting this all right, in the College of Education and Human Ecology at OSU. So she's local to us. I had the privilege and the benefit of taking an advanced qualitative methods course last semester with her, and really had the opportunity to build on, but also dig into not just the qualitative methods work that some of us do in this room and beyond, but also to really dig into this notion of equity upon which our field is, based as our 4 pillars, right? And so I think really thinking about social equity, not just in terms of the types of problems we identify, in policy or in management, but also in the ways that we ask, the types of research questions we ask, how we approach them in our methods, and really thinking through how all those connections come together was something that I also took away from the course with Penny, beyond the kind of methodological work, but certainly imbued in. So I think real benefit in thinking through some of the pillars of public administration as well. So her research is really addressing not just the complexities in qualitative inquiry, but also inequities in higher education and alignments or disconnections between policy and practice in that space. I'll let her obviously talk so much more, but please join me in welcoming Penny, who also will offer some guidance to us around what is reasonable engagement in this conversation today. So thank you all. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you all for the invitation. It's nice to be here. I have to say that the dean invited me to come to Ohio State in fall 2019 to really elevate qualitative research for the college and beyond. And so I have only been here really during COVID, so I feel like I don't know my Ohio State colleagues as much as I would usually. So again, appreciate the invitation about that. And in terms of the Qual Lab, I will not be talking about that for my speech, but I did want to mention that some of the work is available online. We have monthly Qual Lab lunches. We have a research series that's available on our YouTube station that's about unapologetic educational research, advancing anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. We have the Advanced Methods Institute. We have some work that's in our dashboard of resources. There's so much there, so please do feel free to utilize that. I want to share a little bit about where we're going today. And so you've seen the abstract about higher education for the public good and really taking qualitative work and using that toward social change. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank everybody for the labor that you've put into the series. So thank you, Stephanie, Ellen, Nicole, and then to everyone in the college for the invitation and for you for coming today. So I appreciate that you took the time today. So what are we going to talk about today? I will share a land acknowledgement and share a little bit about who I am. I think it's really important that researchers locate themselves because, as I said, we don't really know each other very well. So that way you know a little bit about who I am. And then my why I'm doing this work. And then I'll share about the study, Higher Education for the Public Good study that I had promised in the abstract and that we talked about that might be really interesting to this group. Also talk about where has that research gone since the time that I actually did the research. So I think some of that is interesting and connects to what Nicole was talking about. Research about higher ed for the public good, but also to do the public good. That is our role as a land grant institution. So sharing a little bit about that so you can think for yourselves about what is your work about and how it progresses and makes a difference. And then of course, lots of conversation and time for discussion. So I want to make sure we'll get to that. So I am, and we are in, or most of you are, some of you might be beyond Central Ohio, but I do want to acknowledge the land in Central Ohio as the homeland of the Shawnee Nation, Miami, Wyandotte, and other indigenous communities. And there is a long and violent history about qualitative research on Native people, and it continues today. That's not okay. I was fortunate enough to be invited in to do work with a Red Dirt research team, an Indigenous research team, and only if I'm invited in do I do that kind of work. And I think it's important as qualitative scholars or quant historian, whatever your paradigm is, to really think through how do you go beyond do no harm? What kind of ways are we engaging with communities so that it's not all one-sided? And that ethical piece, I think, is often served by the IRB, certainly, but goes beyond what we are required to do with the IRB. So who am I? So here's my family. I am second generation Italian American on one side, second gen in the States, Sicilian American on the other side. I am very close to my family because I grew up with a single mom who worked 3 jobs to put food on the table. So you know those inserts in your newspaper where you get Target or Kroger or those things. She was busy putting those in the middle of newspapers for everyone, and then worked her way up through advertising and secretary, and had a job indoors. But she always told me that I needed to type. So take typing so that you don't have to work on the line in the Detroit auto industry. I'm from the edge of Detroit. My high school was on 8 Mile and Woodward in that area, which is now pretty cool, actually, Ferndale High School. It wasn't always that way. And I like to really think about the Detroit community, the Ferndale community, and owe them a lot in terms of where I've come from. But my mom, I give her credit. While she didn't go to college, she always asked me about why. Why do I want to join why do I want to try out for theater? Why do I want to take a certain class? Why do I want to do this or that? And her questions about why I wanted to play with Jennifer really became my questions. Why am I doing this? Why am I interested in that? And it really led me toward my areas of inquiry and really thinking about my why. And so I want to share a little bit about that why. So as first gen college, when I got accepted to Michigan State and Eastern Michigan University, which is a regional institution, I didn't know the difference. Why do you want to go to one versus the other? I don't know. I hadn't been on either campus. It doesn't matter to me. But something about Eastern really spoke to me, and that was my choice. And I loved my time there as an RA, working and paying for all my school, and really was able to become a student leader. Did not know that the field of higher ed and student affairs was a thing at all. And so I went to Syracuse University, where I have an MS in communication, interpersonal communication in particular. From there, I worked at Cornell University, and I took courses and gender studies and anthropology and was working there, but they didn't have a degree in higher education and student affairs at Cornell. So while I loved it there, it was about coming back home. And so I have a PhD from the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education, which is one of the top programs Ohio State is as well in my area. And that's where I actually learned to write, to think more deeply, to really engage in some of the work. And I thought I would go back and be a practitioner. But when I realized that research could make social change, research could make a difference, wait a minute, I think this is what I'm interested in. This is what I want to do. I want to make a difference through the research and have the privilege of thinking with people and with communities. So after the PhD, I went to the University of Oklahoma, where assistant, associate, full endowed. It was a wonderful experience. And then NC State, where I was a department head of 50 plus, I think there were 55 faculty and 850 grad students. It was the size of some small colleges, but I think rivals the department here at Ohio State pretty well. And that's when I met the dean, and he invited me to come in and start the Qual Lab and really live that vision that I had dreamed for so long. And so I have a research agenda, and I just want to quickly show you and give a little advice for people who are going up for tenure and promotion, or if you are a grad student thinking about your research interests and how they all connect. For me, this was extremely useful throughout my career to have a visual, to be able to share my research agenda with my colleagues and what my research really is about. And so obviously with my Qual Lab interests, I have an entire research agenda about qualitative inquiry, about methodologies, paradigmatic approaches to research, about really thinking through dominant and non-dominant methodologies, your audience, what you're choosing, how to really engage with research designs. And this is some of the work there. I did some work in the past with sociologists and also with faculty in psychology on diversity in higher ed, thinking about teaching and learning. I still do some of that work now. I also have a national study on women in higher education and student affairs that I had worked on for a while. So I'm less in that area these days, but do draw from it as this is often really connected. And then the work that I'm going to talk about today is really about my higher ed org, and I worked with my dissertation co-chairs. One was in ed policy at St. John, and then one was in English ed, and very much an interpretivist. So here's a very positivist faculty member and an interpretivist faculty member, and working with a committee that just had so many different interests. And so they spurred my interest in connecting across fields and disciplines. The field of higher education, I'm the editor for the Review of Higher Education. It's not situated within our field. We often are connecting across and between different fields and disciplines, and I know you all are in your college as well. So I'm going to focus in on American higher ed leadership and policy, some of the critical issues for higher ed and the public good, as I share with you today. And so I want to just kind of locate and mention about our historical present. We really are in multiple pandemics, and it really, I think, implores us to intervene in ways that really think through iterative processes of research and practice. And I would do my studies that I've done in the past differently today. And then I hope that tomorrow I would do it differently than I would do today, that we're always iteratively engaged and that things are changing. And the world is changing. When we think about things that we're dealing with, whether it's climate change and how things are changing, trans youth in schools and sport, indigenous land, racism as a pandemic, the university that we're in right now, all these areas, I really do think higher ed is unique in the sense of it could work for higher ed for the public good and is situated in that way. And to me, whether your research cries out for equity or not, I do believe that all research, whether it's explicit or implicit, is really meant not to sit on shelves. It's meant to get out there and make a difference in different fields and disciplines. So my research, that's why I'm here today, to share a little bit about this research that I've done. So this quote from Bell Hooks really, for me, situates some of this work. She talks about there must exist a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of ways to transform consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures. And for me, that hits with this study because it is about that social change aspect and transforming structures, and in particular, higher ed for the public good. Thinking about higher ed as individual, but then also as a system and a system within society, and how we could potentially transform higher education. So a little bit about higher education and policy. Higher education, I argue, and I argue this about research as well, really needs to play an instrumental role in addressing the myriad issues that face the world today. And I think that, I just said this, we really are in a space where we could address these complex issues. But let's take a look at higher education as a whole. Real public support for higher ed, it has been decreasing over time. And so I have taken a look at about 22 years of the literature here. State funding has decreased, including in higher ed, although I know our governor has some new initiatives in terms of really helping people with higher education. But overall, state and federal funds have gone down, and the individual burden to carry higher tuition rate has gone up, right? So that has happened over time. State and federal policies have linked higher ed to the market, and this kind of gives that argument about why we can make sure that you feel a need to individually pay, as opposed to this community, the state, the nation coming together. There's also legal challenges that have been happening quite along to admissions, including one before the US Supreme Court right now, actually two, with Harvard and North Carolina. So these are constantly changing in terms of higher education and where we're really wrestling with higher education for the public good. I think there's critical issues that also come along with this. We have this era of accountability and assessment. There's a need to recruit and retain faculty and students of color. We talk about recruitment, but what are we doing in terms of retention? We're dealing with this and the challenge with the ongoing challenges of COVID. We have all these areas of commodification of higher education and the adjunctification of higher education, where there's fewer tenured full professors than when you look at that in comparison to the increase of adjuncts, of lecturers, and also who's making decisions for the curriculum. There's great wealth of research in this area. I think Adriana Kizar is doing incredible work in this area if you're interested in some of it. In addition, there's changes that have been happening and really inequities around race, right? So when we take a look at gender, race, and class, these are very interconnected in these citations as well. They might pick up race or class or gender, but it is about the connections, I think. Brenda Lloyd-Jones, Lori Patton Davis, who is here, and Shayla Haynes also talk about gender and race connected. And so I think that these are areas where we really have to pay attention to how the inequity persists, even though we have this fabulous research that's really making headway. It's not good enough. We're still dealing with inequities across race, class, and gender in higher education. And when you look at that, it really makes a difference to take a look at intergenerational mobility and immobility across race and class, high school to college. It happens across generations. And white students, if you look at the stats, Carnival and Stroll have a number of different pieces about this. Also, Chronicle of Higher Education has their work that comes out every year. But white students have really held on to their dominance in the top four-year colleges and had no enrollment increases when you talk about open access. But when you look at Black, Latinx students, their increases have happened. And it's in open access institutions, which puts a lot of pressure on open access institutions. And when you take a look at funding, there are problematic issues when you take a look there in terms of equity across funding. Native students have stayed the same in open access and in four-year colleges. Also, when you take a look at women graduating from high school and enrolling in college, there's more women that are here in colleges and universities. People are touting that often, but yet if you dive down into the statistics, there are stratifications across institution type, across degree program, hence STEM and STEAM initiatives by our president here at Ohio State. And here's a resource that I would encourage you to look at if this is something that's of interest to you, the merit myth in terms of the divide in higher education. So again, mother-daughter, mother-daughter, when I think about myself and my own mother, when you look at poverty and you look at this cycle of oppression, and Leslie Rex and I talked about that in terms of cumulative oppression or cumulative privilege over generations. And that matches some literature that's out there in social capital as well. So higher ed, when you take a look at higher education, you do have women achieving chief academic officers and provosts, not at the rate as men. Same with full professors. We are here as full professors, but 25% as opposed to 75% of men. And then when you look at the percentage of women of color, whoosh, the higher, the fewer. It goes down dramatically. So for me, as I'm thinking about the context of higher ed and what I want to explore, I'm thinking through, what do all these different areas mean? This is a lot of information that you could dive in and a whole research study on each one of these areas. Of course you could. So for me, I'm thinking, what do I want to do with my research? How do I want to make a difference? So I turn to Foucault, who really talks about whoever holds the power regarding what counts as knowledge also has power over policy, systems, access to education processes. So in the field of higher education, it's university presidents, legislators, faculty administrators. These are the people who are decision makers. Some of them may not necessarily see themselves as gatekeepers in the field, but they do hold this knowledge. And so for me, this is the area that I wanted to explore. So my first literature review, right? We always turn to the literature, and I did a systematic literature review, thinking about what are the different ways that scholars and policymakers in the field really talk about higher education for the public good. So that I'm drawing from existing literature, but I'm going back. I'm thinking through, how did this change over time? And really did this in-depth analysis that I'm not going to talk much about, but I will turn to the Institute for Higher Ed Policy, which provided a framework, and then I expanded on that framework and learned a bit. So let me share, here is I think a very easy to hold on to graph regarding higher ed for the private good. That's an economic benefit, like salaries, improve worker conditions, professional mobility, but also social private, improve quality of life, for example. Public social, increase civic engagement, social cohesion, ability with technology and engaging in social media, and then also that public economic, increased tax revenue, increased workforce flexibility. You also have, and it's no wonder that legislators like our governor are invested in that public economic good, because it makes a difference for the state and the nation. So as I explored the research, I really took a look at higher ed for the public good. That was there where people were only talking about higher ed for the public good, or only higher ed for the private good. And some people, policymakers, were only connected to the private good. I think the Institute for Higher Ed Policy, where they talk about both and as balanced. There are a number of pieces that I found in the literature that really talked about both of these as balanced. In addition, there were areas in the literature that talked about public-private as connected, that they are inextricably linked and they could not pull it apart so readily. And the scholars that talked about the two as interconnected really talked about it from an advocacy approach, from making change. And I would say, I don't know that I want to weigh in here that one is better than another. They're just different. They're very different. And so for me, I wanted to explore, what does this mean with higher ed leaders? How do they talk about higher ed for the public good behind closed doors in naturally occurring contexts? So what is the content of what they're saying? And what is the process of how it's said, how it's responded to or not responded to, so that for me, we could think through myriad ways to address higher ed for the public good, because I have to say we're not quite equitable at the moment. We need to do better. So let's try to think through multiple ways of addressing higher ed for the public good so that we can move this forward. So theoretical framework and methodology, I do take a feminist theory perspective, which includes the intersections of identity here for this study. And this critical discourse analysis was a way that I looked at this, but I did pull in from different fields and disciplines, as you'll see. But qualitative is iterative, and theory, and Chelsea's here today, we wrote a piece about how theory is pervasive throughout a study. It's not just left at the chapter 2 section. It really should be woven throughout. And so for me, these were woven throughout and not as didactic as it might appear in a PowerPoint. So what did I do? I actually had access to, and I didn't attend, but I had access to the conversations for 4 3-day national conferences where higher ed leaders were talking about higher ed for the public good. I actually appreciated that I didn't get to go because I wasn't invested in or paid by the organizers, but I did have access to all this information and wanted to dive into it. So I had access to the curriculum design team and the work that the curriculum committee worked on, the participants who were community leaders, faculty, foundation program officers, grad students were invited, National Association leaders, state legislators, university presidents, all came together in these areas across the United States. The 3 were held in different states across the US. And then what I did is I did member check interviews with participants after I had analyzed some of the data to connect with some of the participants and really see if I was on the right track, right? And here's the information that the national organization had generated. Audio tapes of large group, small group, final reports, all the work that went into it, which was wonderful. I listened to these audio tapes over and over and over again, of course. And then I had word for word transcripts that I wrote. And now we have so many AI opportunities, which I really drew from to some extent. But, you know, for me, I have to type it. As I type it, I'm analyzing and I'm thinking through all these transcripts. The context for the narrative, the context narrative I developed for each of the conferences and how they were different. The member checking interviews that I mentioned, memos, and then numerous tables of turn taking and performance moves as I was walking through this discourse analysis. And so as I was looking at all this information, I was thinking, how am I going to reduce this data? What am I really after here? And what I did was I actually did frequency counts of discursive moves between these peak sessions and non-peak sessions. So what do I mean by that? These are conversations, welcome everybody, glad you're here, and what performance moves like saving face, politeness moves, power and solidarity moves. This is where I turned to my degree in communication and brought in a lot of communication theories as well as models around turn taking, who was interrupting, who was using verbal pauses, etc. And I looked at where it was just seamless, and then where these peak sessions were happening, where there was a lot of engagement, disagreement, agreement, conversation. And this was just a little example of all these counts about why I could argue to policymakers that this is the peak session that I need to focus in on, so I can really take a look at what's going on. Last night I was like, oh, they need to see this slide. I have the original somewhere, but I wanted to show you throughout the sessions pretty regularly. It was actually session 5 where people would get into this conversation in a way where things made a difference. As I went through these peak sessions, then as I reduced it, now I'm focusing in on these peak sessions, and I'm really drawing from, I would say now, Mirka Koro about data multiplication, the ways in which as a researcher your data multiplies. So I'm diving into these peak sessions across all 3 of the events, looking for code switching, face-threatening acts, right? When people save face, you're trying to save face or not, politeness moves, power, solidarity, humor, all these things. I mean, there were about 43 things that I went through to look at. So now findings. I'm just going to go right to the end and share with you what were the main findings. Well, what I confirmed that was existing in the literature was that comments from people of color, women, community partners were silenced, redefined, and or relegated to the margins. It was not in the final reports. That's not new. There's existing literature that talks about this. This confirmed that existing literature that in these national policy conversations, that's what was happening. Also, what I found out was that people who shared non-dominant perspectives, so even if you were a white male full professor, if you had a different perspective than the organizers, regardless of your race, gender, role, your perspective was marginalized, silenced, not put in the national reports in this conversation. So for example, I will say this was not in the data because it was a personal conversation, but describes it well. So white male full professor was talking to me about this, and he was saying, look, when I was talking, it's no surprise you found this, because when I was talking, I had the organizers behind in my face, turning his back on me to remove me from that conversation because I didn't support what he was saying and what was happening. So there's nonverbal work that could be really important in these conversations, but I of course looked at the discourse. So let me quickly, and then I want to move on and talk about where the research has gone, but let me show you a little bit about what happened with Judith, Stephanie, and Courtney as examples. So Judith is a white woman, director of a national organization, a professor, and she was responding to this organizational model, right? And it's your standard ecological model. This was shared by the organizers, and they were talking about higher ed for the public good as that light green area between the system and society. And so what Judith says is, well, wait, I actually think just doing higher ed for the public good needs to be very differentiated. It's about a systems perspective. It's got to be idiosyncratic, opportunistic, differentiated, and it liberates us from just sitting down and coming up with a strategic action plan and one figure with all our benchmarks. And that's very different from the status quo. So she, in this quote, is really challenging the organizers and this model. So from here, Angelo, these are pseudonyms, says, I agree with everything you said, Judith, right? But perhaps I want to talk about this systemic aspect. I think what you're really saying is that maybe one has to work simultaneously from different perspectives. I think what you're really saying is, so he starts to redefine what she says by this move here, and then keeps going with his short monologue about what she is really saying. In a second example, and I didn't have race for everyone, it was only if people mentioned it in the conversations that I have here. I don't have it for this woman who's a sociology professor. And she says, in a different session, entirely different group, she's not with Stephanie at all, so this is an entirely different session. I'm not sure I'm in agreement as well, right? What are some other models of change I want to talk about? And she's asking for grassroots organizing models, other models of change for this conversation. So Joseph responds, well, I suspect that you're asking about other models, and this is invitational. I'm sorry, not invitational, but rhetorical. You're not actually asking me to present these different models in this moment. I hope not. Stephanie, to her credit, says, no, I'd like to hear more models. You know, there's a number of people in this room. What are some other models? So she keeps going. Well, Joseph then talks not about her question, but actually reframes it. So I believe, and then he talks about the excitement of the group and why we're here. And so if you wanted some insight into some of what preceded this, that was it. So actually in that move, they don't bring up Judith. They don't share that Judith also questioned the model by this time. And maybe you would have been prepared for that question, maybe not. But in any case, let me move to Courtney, who is a Latina graduate student, who talks about what sacred cows are we willing to slaughter? What pain are we willing to endure? I mean, people who participate in social movement really think about risks all the time. They think about retribution. I mean, they pay with their lives. They pay with their futures and their reputations. And I don't really hear us or see us talking about those things. We're talking about making change in very safe ways that allows us to maintain our status, that allows to maintain our privilege and comfortability. And she even gets a "that's right" from somebody else in the room, right? So there's energy around her talk. We have to be true. We have to tell the truth about things. We have to be willing to give up some of our own power. So Courtney's powerful comments that were echoed by people in the room were not discussed by the organizers later in the conference. They were not included in the final reporting documents. The omission from final reporting documents, there's been policy ways in which women have been silenced in policy environments in other research from 2004. And so this supports some of that. It also, I think there's ways in which I talk about racial battle fatigue and how if you constantly are talking and passionate and engaging and you're at the table and you're sharing this and you're not getting listened to and you're getting silenced in this way, that contributes to racial battle fatigue. William Smith is at the University of Utah doing some fabulous work there. Stephen Quay here at Ohio State. Also, Larry Rowley talks about symbolic violence, and there's a way in which that's violent within the policy circles. So here we have the resistance for the models and the work redefined, reframed, and silenced. So these are patterns. They may seem unconnected. You could go that route, but I actually do think that these are patterns as these are representational examples. There were examples from community partners that I actually dive into in another publication that I have where it's community partners where similar things are happening too in these ways. But these are patterns of institutional sexism, racism, and in that example, it's about roles in addition, your role as a community partner and your voice. So it occurred even in sessions where I met the organizers. They were trying to be inclusive about race and gender and roles. So if you're trying and this is still happening, what are we missing? my new question was about what we're missing. And so Judith talks about this idiosyncratic differentiated educational change kind of model. And she really wants a model like this. And actually, if you look at some of Al Gore's work over time with climate change, he offered more of an idiosyncratic differentiated kind of model that she's talking about if you watch how that has changed over time with Al Gore, and then also morphing into so many people are about climate change. It is not just him, and he will be the first, I would assume. I've only heard him speak about this live and online, but to say that it's beyond, it's everybody's issue. And so it has changed over time in important systemic ways. Stephanie talks about grassroots models for educational change. And I mentioned before quickly that Judith's differentiated model, she provides a different model that Stephanie's asking for. It was not resurrected by the organizers. It was kind of left in that session, and they weren't brought together in final reports to talk about, hey, here are these different models. So we're missing something here. We're missing something. And Courtney, with her truth telling and talking about privilege and recognizing the cycle of oppression, is powerful and explored elsewhere. So watching time, and I want to make sure we have time for our conversation, but really in a race and equity matters in so many different ways. And we could be providing more models about paying attention to cognitive processing models, centering voices of racially minoritized people, paying attention to power brokers, how things are being organized, how voices are not included, what are we leaving at the door because we do not subscribe to it, believe in it, and then we miss that opportunity to really make change. So there are some different models to answer these questions that some of the women were asking for. You have Chesler, Lewis, and Crowfoot in Challenging Racism in Higher Education, offering a model for strategic change in higher education. I encourage you to look at that. Adriana Kezar and colleagues talked about with STEM models for change. You also have Snap, Crackle, Pop, your Kellogg Foundation that does a lot of work across the globe with systemic change. They also have a model for change about awareness, understanding, commitment, and action, and that it should fold on itself. And so some of the work that I did in this study, and I think that this is really powerful, it's beyond anything I could imagine in terms of where this work has gone. I did share it with event organizers, and while it took a while for some of them to hear it, I think we have come together and have done things together now with a different kind of model for listening to all voices. And one of the examples was I was invited to actually change how a group was having conversations about DACA at the White House and the ways in which we were listening to all voices, including the undocumented students who were in the room and having the policy conversations, how to pay attention and not leave to the margins. And another thing I could never have imagined was that some of this work was used as in Poland as they were reshaping the higher education system in Poland. Also, graduate school dean conference with talking about racial diversity and equity and inclusion in graduate schools across the country. Some of this work was used there. At Oxford with a group on women, and that tends the feminist perspective, and this, the Society for the Education of Women. But we really, I think, to pull it full circle, we're at a crossroads where, as Denson and Garadina talk about, we really need to make transformative inquiries. The world is crying out for this. We need emancipatory visions that provide a moral authority to move people, to struggle, to resist, to make change. And this is where I think your research in public affairs, higher ed, policy circles really can make a difference. Where are you making that difference? people are crying out. Here's examples of a few. And so what is your passion? What is your why? Where is your research going to take you? And how could it make change in communities? Here's a few examples of people who I think are doing incredible work that are making change with their research. And Muhammad Khalifa is here at Ohio State. If Nicole and I were just talking about him a second ago. But let me end with questions for you all. What are your qualitative research questions? What are your congruent and rigorous, quote unquote, rigorous designs that are designed for your audience so that policymakers, if that's your audience, are going to listen to you? Those moves, that work, the approach of the counting is not my intuitive sense, but it gave me a way in with policymakers that I would not have had if I did not take up that kind of approach, more of that counting frequency before I got to these discourse moves in identifying the peak and non-peak sessions. How might your work and your research really contribute to a transformative future in ways that you can imagine, like changing in policy circles, and ways you can't imagine, like in Poland, how the system is changing based on that? Well, some of the things that I recently did with Dr. E. Alexander, who's a graduate from Ohio State, it just came out this past month, Advancing Culturally Responsive Research. And researchers, I want to offer you the discount because we talk about some of the ways you could do this with qual, quant, and mixed methods in this book. And I really thank you for having me here, and I look forward to our conversation together about your research, my research, if you would like, and where we could take this. So thank you.
Thank you. And you've got some reactions in the boxes with other applause.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for such an engaging talk per usual. Let me open it up to the group with questions or comments.
And as we open up to the group, since this is kind of the aspect where we're having a conversation, we really encourage anyone that's comfortable turn on their videos just so it feels more like a conversation.
Yes. Thank you for that, Ellen. Yes, I echo that. I understand you might not all be in spaces where you can do that, but I would love for you to unmute and engage. Thank you.
I'll ask a question, I guess, while we're waiting and others are formulating their questions. I love what you just said about a great presentation, first of all. This was really, really excellent. I love what you said about the counting being something that you needed to do in order to get into the room. And I was actually thinking about that because I know I've been kind of, I've played with qualitative methods before, and in my first foray into it, I used to count things, and then I was told, oh, you're not supposed to count things. Like, that's not what you do in qualitative methods. Oh, I gotta reread. And so to see you do that, I was like, wait a minute, why is she counting things? But it's interesting that you said that you needed to do that in order to have so I just wondered if you wanted to share a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Yes, I appreciate that because I do, for me as a qualitative scholar, I go to more of that interpretivist or actually critical paradigm. I've written on critical advocacy work and a critical advocacy paradigm, right? And in a critical advocacy paradigm, that's not what people think of automatically, right? This counting and frequency counts, right? That's often we think of that as very post-positivist, and you have the quant colleagues, and some of my first publication was actually in quantitative work. And so I think we're past the paradigm wars. I would like to think, I hope we're past the paradigm wars, and where one is better than the other. It's about what is the question, what is the best way to answer that question. And for me, it was about what's happening in this discourse. And I was ready to jump into those peak sessions. Why? Because I listened to it over and over and over, and I could tell you that those were the peak sessions, but I got feedback that those peak sessions were, not everybody would believe me, right? If you're a policymaker, you might be making policy based on what somebody's telling you over the fence in your neighborhood, right? But you also want some data, you want some information, you want to know for sure. And so this allowed me, that frequency count, to prove to my audience that these were in fact peak sessions. And it also, I would say, allowed me to look at how many times people were saving face, how many times people were cutting other people off, how many times women in particular were hedging or using nonverbal pauses, community partners, and graduate students as well. And so I had such a wealth of information that I wouldn't have had if I didn't have to prove this to my audience. And so it actually allowed me to go further with the analysis and learn so much more. It meant, here I'm doing in the book, you know, you'll see these 2 chapters that might not necessarily seem congruent if you're talking about qualitative research, but I think I over time have come to argue that actually it is. I need to argue and to be in spaces to make change. If you can't hear me, I can't make the change. I can't share this information with you if you're going to cut me off and not really listen to me. And that's actually the topic and the process part of what this talk was about. So how do I get myself in the rooms? How do I share with the audience in ways that they will believe me and know that this is what's going on? Well, now I have some credibility. And I would argue I should have had that credibility before, because I, as a researcher, should be believed, researcher as instrument, but it wasn't going to happen without that. So I'm actually really thankful for the feedback and for actually doing a stronger, more robust study. I would argue that actually is a bit more congruent than I might have thought about earlier in my career. Yeah, thanks for that, Stephanie.
Thanks, Penny.
So I have does someone, you can go. I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
No, go, Cynthia. It's good.
How about-
I'm sorry, go ahead.
My question pairs very well with the question that Stephanie just said. So it seems like discourse analysis can be paired with quantitative data, but I'm wondering if there's other qualitative methods, like, you know, we're going to talk a little bit more about how do you say it?
Phenomenology?
Narrative inquiry, and seeing if those types of qualitative inquiries can be pursued by also doing quantitative data, or are there some where you really can't pair them?
Yes, I think that's a great question. So narrative, so if you look at the kind of false continuum of paradigms, right? This positivist, post-positivist, more pragmatic and interpretivist and constructivist and postmodern approaches, right? They're all really different, and some really narrative coming out of an interpretivist tradition doesn't necessarily do that counting, right? But you do have content analysis, discourse analysis, and discourse analysis doesn't always have to be about the counting. There's so much discourse analysis that really dives into line by line or word for word and inflection and all that. I mean, there's so many different approaches. So you've got case study, narrative, phenomenology, ethnography, autoethnography, scholarly personal narrative. I mean, I could just keep going on. And actually with students in my class, I have a whole list of what are all these methodologies, and you have all these paradigms, right? So you're kind of thinking across paradigms in I'm saying this is not so didactic, right? But if you think across paradigms and then you think down in terms of my methodology and my methods for collection and analysis, there are so many infinite ways that you could pair these to answer your question. And so I would always start with your question. What is your research question? And how can you best answer it? What is the methodology that connects with it? What is your inherent paradigmatic approach? Because I would say paradigmatically, and qualitative scholars argue you can't really change paradigms. If you draw from different paradigms, you're actually just reducing everything to method. So I'm just gonna get way off. So let me just say, yeah, there's so much. I mean, case study is a really good example where you could draw from quant and qual. And you could go into this historical element with the Red Dirt research team. That's what we use. And we actually argue to unbind things and pull in history. So there's so many different approaches. And even with phenomenology, you mentioned phenomenology. So is it more of a transcendental approach to phenomenology, which is more post-positivist, which might be more like wringing out your data in a lockstep way, more like Strauss and Corbin with grounded theory, or is it more of a hermeneutic phenomenology, which is more like Kathy Shermaz and her interpretivist, constructivist approach to grounded theory? Is it postmodern? You have Adele Clark who does situational analysis, which is really postmodern approaches to grounded theory. You have existential phenomenology, you have queer phenomenology, you have all these different tools in front of you. And so I would say this is one of the things that I've appreciated about the Qual Lab. Try to make all that really simple and think about what's your best match. What is your question? What's your best match? And how to make sure that you're true to yourself as a researcher and paying attention to your audience as you make these choices to answer your research question. Cynthia, did I get at it, or did I really start to give a lot?
That's amazing. Yeah, I have to definitely talk more to our TAs because I have a lot of questions.
Great, excellent. Thank you. Long.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And this might not be the focus of your research, but when I saw your framing earlier about public versus private benefits, I just naturally had this hypothesis that whether an education leader emphasizes public or private benefits depends a lot on their targeted audience and on their goals, right? So, for example, I would assume that if a leader is talking to maybe students and parents, then maybe they're more likely to emphasize the private benefits, while when they talk to maybe the government or some foundations, then maybe they have incentive to emphasize the public benefits. So I'm just wondering whether you have noticed that in your research or something that you're planning to explore. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. You're so right. I really did find some of the state legislators who were under pressure to make sure that their state is economically viable, that communities have access to community colleges, for example, to trade schools, to education. It was about the private good and really thinking about higher ed for the private good, for that economic engine of my state or of the country. And so a lot of policymakers, it was about the private good. This will help your state in these tangible economic ways. And there's also a thing called externalities, where if you educate this group with higher education, their income will go up this much. But externalities is that the community around me, their income will also go up. Well, what does that mean? If you're a governor, that means more taxes, more, community funds, right? So that concept is extremely important, I found, with policymakers. And there's a way in which higher ed for the public good, when you talk about community colleges' missions in serving the community and working with local businesses to make sure that we're training up the people for your community or for your business. When you think about Intel and Ohio State and the relationship there, so here's Intel. We need a workforce that's going to be able to work with Intel. And so you have not just Ohio State, but a number of the colleges in the state. I had some state slides, so I deleted that for time. But you have this relationship between the two. And so part of it could be about community, the ways in which your community could benefit, and more engagement in the PTA if you go to college, and more engagement in hobbies and different things. But there's also that financial element that I think policymakers will, because of their job and their approach. But if you talk to some of the people in community colleges who were there in this example, in my study, for example, it was about more of a sense of public giving back. How can I serve businesses? How can I serve the community, work with partners? And so I think you're right, based on who people were, they were all coming from their own cognitive processing model is what I talk about in the larger study, their own cognitive process model to get to what they saw as important from their own worldview or their own vantage point. So being able as a researcher to see all those vantage points, I think is really useful for us. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Aditi. Thank you for the presentation. I would say it was informative, but more than that, it was inspiring. My question is a methodology related question, and I have a particular project in mind when I'm asking this question. So the question is basically like in your presentation, you mentioned, how many sessions you kind of observed and recorded, and, how, basically you mentioned, how much the length of your data, length and breadth of your data. But my question is how much of that data is enough? And, especially if I'm focusing on a conversation that happened in the past. So it's no longer kind of ongoing, but I'm focusing on something that happened in the past. So, yeah.
I think that's such a good question. And it's such a common one for researchers. How do you know you're done? How do you know enough is enough? Right. And I think this is where, as a researcher, trusting yourself and also your research team. Who's your research team? Because other than an exam that might have to be done only by yourself, most research is done in collaboration, where you have colleagues you can talk with, you have the dissertation committee, you have people to connect with. And I would say we often hit a saturation point, right? So when is it saturated? When is it, I'm getting multiple answers and I still don't know, so I need more data. And so I don't think there's, to your point, there's not a magic number of, oh, you need this many conversations or this many pages of transcripts. It's all situation dependent. To me, qualitative is all local. It's local and needs to be really about that particular study. And generalizability ends up becoming, I know a lot of people talk about that in quant. Absolutely. Is this generalizable? In qualitative, for some qual scholars, yes, it's generalized. I want to be able to generalize across community colleges. But for others, generalizability is not the focus, and it's about that depth of research in this one situation. And autoethnography, for example, I mean, here's my experience about my mom, but it's not generalizable to all second-gen Italians, right? But it might help inspire more knowledge or useful recommendations. Is that so? I would work with your team. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was helpful.
Thank you for that question.
So thank you for those questions, everyone. And please join me in another round of emoji reaction or actual applause for Dr. Pasque. Thank you so much for your rich presentation and, of course, for your instruction and inspiration today. For those students who are here who want to hang, Dr. Pasque has offered some more of her time very graciously. But otherwise, hope to see all of you next week when we have Dr. Terrence Hinton. A bio, an announcement, an abstract will go out, of course, before then. But we'll have Colloquium again next Monday with Dr. Hinton.
Thank you, everyone.
Penny. Thanks, Penny. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
And those of us who are staying, hang out if you'd like.